So I've been waiting for this game for, at this point, almost a decade. Yakuza Ishin has finally made its way over to the US. It's been, well, localized, meaning that it's been added with English subtitles. This is still the original cast, the original voiceover work. And although this game is technically a remake of a cross-generation PS3 and PS4 game, it's more akin to a remaster. The amount of work that's been put into it is more akin to a remaster. So you are going to get a game that's been transported into a brand new engine. This is Unreal Engine 4, and it's sort of been given a facelift with higher quality visuals, an upgrade in frame rates, and the entire game has essentially been rebuilt in Unreal Engine 4, so the visual aesthetic of the game wouldn't look too dated by today's standards. And like I said, I've been waiting for this game for a very, very long time. Yakuza Ishin was a PlayStation 4 launch title in Japan, and to have a game of this style and caliber immediately at launch for the PS4 must have been fantastic for the Japanese market. But it's a game that very much intrigued me because this game is actually based on historical events. It's been inspired by actual true history and true events that actually occurred in Japan at this time zone. And the entire Yakuza cast, everyone comes back here to basically play as different historical figures going through this time. And it's basically the age, the end of the era of samurai, where democracy started taking over in Japan, and it just resulted in this entire shift in power. And so Yakuza Ishin tells the story of Sakamoto Ryoma, who is a famed samurai during the Edo period in Japan. This is the mid 1800s, where basically his actions directly led the movements for the downfall of samurai and the uprise to a democratic power in the Japanese government. And so it's this really interesting take on actual historical events. And while, yes, for the sake of it being a video game, some events are slightly exaggerated. There are some, different twists and turns that kind of take some liberties with the main story. But for the most part, you're going to be interacting with these incredible amount of historical figures. And again, the entire Yakuza cast is playing these characters sort of in a similar style to how they play their Yakuza characters. But from what I understand, the way that they've actually divvied out these actors is depending on the personality types of the actual historical figures in place. And so everyone sort of has their own style of doing things. You're going to come across the same colorful cast of characters, but it's done within a different light. It's very interesting because enemies that were previously villains in the prior Yakuza games are now like your friends in this one, playing completely different characters. It's this really, really awesome kind of mix mash of these different character archetypes kind of coming together to tell this really amazing story. And quite honestly, this game kind of starts off slow, but after it gets going, it's similar to the other Yakuza games. It does not let you go. You're going to be hooked to the very end of this. And I had a great time playing this game. Actually, the more I played it, the more I began liking it. And there's a lot of different elements to this game, including the gameplay, which has been dramatically shifted from the prior Yakuza and Like a Dragon video games. So Like a Dragon Ishin comes packed with 4 types of combat systems that you can kind of switch off between during the combat in real time. Depending on the enemy you're facing, one might be more advantageous than the other. So you have your standard melee combat, which is more similar to the prior Yakuza games, the older ones. You have sword combat, so you can focus in on an enemy. This is good for sort of one-to-one melee combat where you can kind of, focus on one enemy, do dodges, do blocks, and kind of just get some combos in there. You have an actual pistol combat at this time, so it's, again, running on an older sort of system of the Yakuza games. So, this isn't going to be a third-person shooter mechanic at all, but you can lock onto enemies and just start firing away at your pistol. You have completely unlimited ammo, from what I understand, or at least you get so many bullets at one time, it doesn't even matter. Your character never has to reload. And then you have this cool mode, which is the one I use the most. It's kind of like the wild gunslinger. So he yields a pistol in one hand and a sword in the other. And this is really good for attacking groups of enemies at one time. It's a lot of kind of spinning, lots of area of attack abilities. You can do dodges, and there's a lot of invincibility windows that you can kind of take advantage to. So when you're being attacked at once, you can kind of dodge and get out of the way as fast as possible. I use that system, that combat maneuver, the most out of all of them. It's the one I upgraded almost completely, and it's the one that kind of got me through the vast majority of the game, just because the attack style is so quick that a lot of enemies just don't really have much of a chance against you when you're just flailing your arms and you're shooting them at the same time. It's quite insane. So when I first played the demo, I was a bit lukewarm on the combat because it felt to me that it was a bit stiff. I wanted it to be a little bit more loose, a little bit more easier to control, and just have better handling overall. Because this game is running on a different engine, and I'll get to the visuals a little bit later, there is a slightly different feel that this game has to the prior Yakuza games. It feels a lot more weighted. So you kind of have less agility with this game. There's a little bit less of a responsive control scheme this time around. And so you're playing the game and you have to kind of adjust your mindset to the idea that because it's running on a different engine, there's a slightly different feel to the way that the game plays. Again, it feels a lot more weighty in that respect. So you have to just kind of keep in mind when you're doing these combos that you have to give yourself a little bit more time to adjust to the controls, to get the dodging and the combo timing windows out of the way and all that stuff. However, I had to say that after spending more time with the combat, I didn't feel it was any bit of a hindrance. While it does inherit a more older school game design, again, this is a game from 2014. It was cross-gen with the PS3 and a launch title for the PS4 in Japan. So it's still, this is why I kind of mentioned earlier on in this video, although it's technically a remake, it has more work, the work put into it is more similar to a remaster, where they didn't actually go in there and change up drastically how the combat feels, if at all. They kept mostly basically the same animations, the same type of attacks, and the same upgrades and menus and whatnot. So it's basically a remastered version of the game, but again, it's running on a different engine, so you have to kind of adjust to basically the way that this game feels. And it is a bit more slower. It is a little bit less responsive than what you would typically expect from a hack and slash style game. However, once you spend time with it, I didn't feel it was any hindrance to me actually playing the game at all. Once I adjusted to it, I was able to get through the game just fine. There were some difficult moments, but for the most part, this game is pretty forgiving, and I have to say, it's mostly just kind of a mindless button masher experience. There are some combos in place. The game can get a little bit more complex. They have a new trading card system in this game where certain abilities that you have and certain power-ups and buffs can be applied to certain cards that you actually have within your deck, and each combat system within the game, each of the 4 types of combat can have their own set of decks, basically, for different power-ups and abilities, so you can kind of switch off depending on what you're doing. So I didn't really focus too much on that during my main playthrough because it kind of has a mini game involved. There's a dungeon system in this game where if you do a lot of grinding, you can get better power-ups. You can play this game though pretty much through a casual experience, doing a couple side missions here or there, kind of just ignoring the card system, and get through relatively without any big sort of issues. There's only about 1 or 2 boss fights that I've faced that actually were kind of difficult and took me a little bit over an hour to actually complete. And with that being said, let's now talk about the graphics of the game. As I said before, this is a remake, technically speaking, because it's got a completely different engine. This is Unreal Engine 4, moving away from the old PlayStation 3 and PS4 engine for the prior Yakuza games. The newer ones run on the Dragon engine. That was Yakuza 6, Kiwami 2, and the Like a Dragon Yakuza game, as well as the Judgment games, mind you. So this one is Unreal Engine 4. Now, for the most part, I have to say that visually speaking, this is a very consistent title. It doesn't look, current generation in that it's released solely on the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. But I have to say that this game does actually impress with its visuals. The cutscenes in particular have gotten a huge boost in quality. And I feel that cinematically, there is nothing here that separates it whatsoever from the prior Yakuza games. It still does a fantastic job of really detailing these characters, showing all the nuance of emotions. The Ryugai Gotoku studio has done a tremendous job with all of their games in just making characters look really believable and lifelike when those conversations start taking place. And it's the same thing here. I think the environments look fantastic. The game on the Xbox Series X and the PS4 PS5 runs at a 1440p 60 FPS sole mode. I think it's the only way you can actually play this game. There's not a performance mode or quality mode or anything like that added to this experience. So that's your resolution and that's your frame rate. I noticed 0 dips whatsoever, at least on the Series X, and from what I understand, the PS5 is very smooth as well. The frame rate was consistent. The visuals were consistent. No issues there. There were a handful of weird visual glitches, though, I did notice. Things like flickering textures. I also noticed at one point that walking into an area, the game didn't seem to load the entire area. And so, like, the whole entire skybox would, like, flash. Like, if I was an epileptic, I would have had a seizure on the spot. But, I mean, that was only, like, kind of few and far between. It took me around 25 hours to get through this game from start to finish. And so out of that entire experience, I noticed only a handful of bugs, and they weren't anything that actually destroyed the core of the game at all. It was just kind of weird visual oddities that seemed to pop up during, certain points in time. There's no special effects here like ray tracing or anything like that, and unfortunately, because it is Unreal Engine 4, you do have to kind of contend with the basic Unreal Engine 4 issues. So yes, there is texture load-in and texture pop-in in this game. It is somewhat frequent. It isn't as bad as Destroy All Humans 2, mind you, but it is pretty noticeable, I would say. It doesn't happen during the cutscenes that much. It seems to happen mostly during gameplay when you're running around the world. You might notice like the ground before you didn't load in right away, and so you'll see things kind of pop in from time to time again. Again, it's not so distracting. It isn't the worst case I've ever seen, but this seems to be a consistent issue with a lot of Unreal Engine 4 titles, and it's no exception here. Unfortunately, yes, there is some texture popping with this game. It doesn't distract too much from the experience, but yes, you will actually notice it. Now, speaking about sound design, I feel this is pretty serviceable for this game. The soundtrack itself didn't really make any points to kind of stand out or, kind of be noticeable. It's there, it adds some emotional weight behind some of the scenes. And then it sort of plays out in the background. You're going to have your standard, Yakuza sound, battle music and stuff like that. So kind of expect that. It's more instrumental and more to the tunes of what you would expect from something like a samurai period type film or anything like that. So I feel like it does a good job of at least being a part of the main experience. But to me, it didn't really stand out as being something noticeable or even noteworthy that much. Same thing with sound design. I feel this is pretty passable as well. Nothing in terms of the game made me say wow, or I feel like in combat as well, like the sounds didn't really help me understand at least where enemies are. Not that I had really much of an issue here, but yeah, sound design is sort of there. It's inoffensive. It doesn't really make much of a point to be noticeable, and I feel that the music is perfectly fine for the experience that is on hands here. Now, lastly, I just want to touch upon the controls here. Again, this is mostly decent. As I mentioned before, there's a bit of weight added to the controls with this new engine scheme here, but this is still an old school Yakuza game. So if you had played the prior titles prior to like the Yakuza 6 and the Dragon engine, so anything like Yakuza 4, 5, Yakuza 0, or any of those types of games, the original Yakuza Kiwami as well, it's going to be more similar to those styles of games. So expect that there are some points where you're going to hit some loading screens. It's not going to be super seamless with the world. Your character's going to be kind of running around. Most of the side cast and the actual NPCs are not voiced whatsoever. And so there is a bit of a less dynamism when it comes to the world. It doesn't feel as interactive as I think some of the later Yakuza games. So, just keep in mind that, again, this is why I mentioned before, it's a remake, but it has more work put into it akin to a remaster, where it's more about just upgrading the visuals. They kept the same core principles of the actual game design in place. The only thing I will say about the controls is because this is of an older school design, the only issue that I ran into, and this seemed to come up consistently throughout the experience, was the camera. The camera just seems to go crazy when you're entering tight spaces. I noticed that a lot of times the camera won't kind of adjust correctly to where you're kind of going. It's not it's centered on your character, but it's completely manual to the point where you're going to have to kind of adjust it to at almost all points, especially when you're in combat as well. You might be fighting an enemy who's off screen. You have to turn your camera around to face them. And when you're entering small areas like shops or going through different alleyways and stuff like that, the camera can get a bit uncooperative. So it's worth noting that as well, that just keep in mind that when you're going into this game, even though it is sold technically as a budget game experience, I believe this game is only $50. So it's not a full price release, but this is of an older school game design. Although it's a remake, just think of it more of a remaster of a game that's almost a decade old. So other than that, I feel like the game is great in terms of its quality. I will have to say it really surprised me with its story, because although this is a spin-off, technically, it doesn't have anything to do with the mainline Yakuza games. It takes place hundreds of years before those actual games. I have to say that this story really surprised me. Some of the most fun I've had was when new characters were being introduced. And you think that this person was just added for the sake of the game, right? You're looking at some of the prior Yakuza casts sort of inhabit new characters and different personalities. As I said before, some villains from the prior game are now like your friends here. It's very, very, very interesting and very cool. And the most fun I had was when new characters were introduced. I would go on my phone and start looking up the character names, and you can just read like the Wikipedia about all of them. And it's really fascinating. I feel that this story is a very fascinating tale about actual history and what these characters kind of went through in order to instill a true democracy in Japan, end things like slavery and this whole class hierarchy system where and people, like, if you weren't part of the wealthy or the royalty, you were just mistreated. You never got anything. And this game really kind of touches upon that, and it shows you firsthand sort of the environment that these people had to live in. And it's pretty remarkable, actually, if you kind of look into the story. Although this story is a little bit more on the creative side, the game doesn't actually recreate history from point to point to point. It more so takes sort of the historical elements and some of the true events that actually happened and puts a creative spin on it. So that's what I mean by it being slightly exaggerated. When you're playing this game, you're not getting a true reenactment of what happened in history. You're getting this really cool, interesting story that's kind of creatively taking twists and turns and liberties to make it a little bit more interesting, and for the sake of a video game, much more engaging as well. I had a great time playing Yakuza Ishin. It surprised me. I thought I was definitely going to like it because I like all the Ryuga Gotoku games. These are fantastic games with fantastic stories, so I knew I was going to experience something that was actually going to be entertaining. But I was actually very surprised. This is a great game that is worth your time. You can get I spent 25 hours in the game, and there was still a lot of stuff that I could have done that I didn't do. I did about half the side missions during my playthrough of the game, so there's a lot of content here. And the world itself, it's a brand new open world. It's actually pretty decently sized in scale, much bigger than Kamurocho or any of those other places. So it's got its own kind of cool flavor and its own world to explore, and they faithfully recreate the time period and all that stuff. I mean, yeah, I feel like a Dragon Ishin is a fantastic game, another fantastic entry for Ryuga Gotoku Studios. And if you're a fan of the Yakuza titles, you're not going to be disappointed here. This is going to be a great game, even if you haven't played the prior games and you kind of like the time period, or maybe that interests you, or even the combat system in the game, which has been much different from the prior Yakuza games. Again, you have to adjust to the controls a little bit. It is of an older school design, but you'll experience a really wildly entertaining storyline with a great cast of characters. And it's one I'm glad I played, and one I'm glad finally got localized. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed my little review of Like a Dragon Ishin. If you guys played the game, let me know what you think. As far as rating it with the other Yakuza games, well, again, it's unrelated, so I feel it's unfair to rank it in terms of its story and how good I feel it is. As a spin-off to the franchise, I just want to say it's definitely worth your time. It's definitely an entertaining game, and yeah, it's nice because you don't even need to know anything about the prior Yakuza games. Even if you're not a fan of those games for whatever reason, it's a bit of a different feel here. It's still got a lot of the developer's flavor, their personality, their directing style, all that is in here, but the gameplay is different. and the storyline deals with something really cool. And again, it's historical, so it's actually quite fascinating as well. Guys, I will talk with you all later. Thank you so much for watching this video, and have a great day.